Hi, everybody. I'm Jeff Gedman. I'm co-founder of a publication and group based in Washington called American Purpose. I'm on leave of absence and serving currently as the acting president of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. I'm joining from Prague today. And forgive me if I have to excuse myself a little bit early, but I'm keenly interested in the round and the discussion. Special thanks to Sid Lipset, my colleague of American Purpose, U.S. Institute of Peace, the Institute of Current World Affairs, and its leader, Greg Pfeiffer, whom you all know as distinguished and leading analyst, book author, and expert on Russia, civil society, and democratization. I'm going to turn it over to you, Greg, in just a moment to introduce the panelists in the session. I'll just say that I think this is an exceptionally important series. This is part two, and this conversation may go in any number of directions today, but I am in particular in the series interested in questions such as the effect of brain drain on Russia, if that's the appropriate expression and an appropriate question. I'm keenly interested in learning more about where the considerable number of Russians are and have been going to live and work outside the country. I'm certainly interested in emerging centers of civil society or dissent or opposition. I'm very curious about whether across the board there's something one might call a common operating picture or view of both developments inside Russia and the war in Ukraine. And then I would say, Greg, for my part, last and certainly not least, what role these networks, these important and vibrant networks, may play in due course in the shape of a post-Putin Russia. Thoughts from my side just in framing, but you, Greg, will lead the conversation, beginning with your thoughts and introduction of three outstanding panelists. Thanks, everybody, for joining. Greg, over to you.
Jeff, thank you so much. And also to American Purpose and the U.S. Institute of Peace for putting on this panel series with us. And terrific questions, Jeff. And some of these questions we're addressing over the course of the four panels, but hope to get to some of them today. Thanks also to everybody for joining. It's good to see so many people taking part, and I can just say that we have a very impressive audience today. So let me start by saying that Vladimir Putin, as we all know, took power first in Russia a quarter century ago now, almost. And since that time, the country's democratic opposition has shared the fate of other political forces confronting autocratic regimes around the world. It's been marginalized, ostracized, and ultimately criminalized by an authoritarian government that successfully exploits the state to marginalize and push away its rivals. And also, like in many other countries, the Russian opposition has been riven by infighting. Now, of course, there are virtually no independent figures left in Russia in politics outside prison, thanks to the draconian repression that the Kremlin has ramped up since the launch of Putin's genocidal war against Ukraine last year. The opposition leaders, Yashin, Alexei Navalny, Vladimir Karamurza, and others are among the hundreds of political prisoners, if not more, who can realistically expect their freedom only after the end of Putinism. The political opposition now essentially exists abroad in exile, where it seems that some of its main groups are at war with each other as well as the Kremlin. So who are they? What are they doing to oppose Putin? How do they see the battle ahead? And what should Western governments be doing to help? If anybody can tell us that, it's the members of our stellar panel today. We are lucky to have them. Thank you so much for joining. Ekaterina Schulmann is a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center in Berlin. She's a political scientist specializing in the decision-making and bureaucratic behavior of modern authoritarian regimes with emphasis on Russia. She's one of the most closely followed online sources of insight for Russian-speaking audiences on the internet and hosts Status, a popular weekly online program. Sergey Aleksashenko is former Russian deputy finance minister and former deputy governor of the Russian Central Bank. He was director of macroeconomic studies at Moscow's prestigious Higher School of Economics and has served as managing director of Merrill Lynch's Moscow office. He is also the author of Battle for the Ruble and currently serves on the board of the Boris Nemtsov Foundation for Freedom and the Free Russia Foundation. And Vladimir Milov, and Kat, is a Russian opposition politician and former deputy energy minister. He's an economist and author of major energy reform concepts, including for Gazprom, which was banned from implementation by Putin himself. Milov is currently vice president for international advocacy at the Free Russia Foundation and a close Navalny ally who hosts a popular YouTube program. So we'll talk for about 40 minutes, followed by a Q&A with the audience. Please type your questions into the Q&A chat, and I'll put them to our speakers. And please identify yourselves in your questions. We're aiming for about an hour of conversation, but we may go a little bit over, up to 15 minutes for anyone who wants to stay on. So I'd like to pose a general question first before getting into specifics about the opposition. I want to ask about the Kremlin's war against Ukraine, because that's the main challenge today. Outside Russia, the opposition is criticized for not doing enough to stop the conflict, or for not remaining in Russia to battle Putin. But as one commentator recently wrote about the opposition leaders of Russia, those, quote, who were once at the forefront of the fight against Putin now find themselves with less influence and visibility than the Ukrainian people, whom this fight should never have befallen, end quote. More broadly, there are also calls to reject all Russian culture, blame all Russian society, and see all Russian history as leading to the war, which I find almost the reverse of the kind of attitudes we saw about Russia in the 1990s. Then it was the failure to take history and political culture into account when the Soviet Union was seen as a blank slate for building a new democratic society. So maybe I'll start with you, Vladimir, and Ekaterina and Sergey, please follow up or jump in. How do you address the collective blame for the war, and how is that collective blame affecting the ability to counter Putin on the part of those who have actually led the battle against him for many years?
Thank you, Greg, and it's a great pleasure to join such a distinguished company. I won't take too much of your time with introductory remarks. I would start by saying that there is a difference between collective responsibility and collective blame, collective guilt, because we will all the members of the Russian society, we will all bear collective responsibility, and no one will be able to escape that, because Russia will have to pay a price for all this immense damage that Putin is currently doing to Ukraine. And even those who opposed Putin, opposed the war, I mean, there is no precise calibration. All of this burden will be somehow shared between all of the citizens of Russia. However, all this discussion about collective blame and collective guilt is extremely counterproductive. I just returned from the Warsaw Security Forum, where we had exactly this. I mean, in Central and Eastern Europe, there's a very clear framing of that all Russians are bad, they have been perpetual imperialists, which is why they are all to blame. This is absolutely not true. And if we are seriously to discuss the origins of Putin's aggression and the attitude of Russian society, we should recall what happened 20 years ago in Russia. If you look at any opinion poll, like predominant attitude to Joseph Stalin was negative in the first Vladimir Putin's presidential term. Levada Center have a very good table with dynamics of this opinion polling on Stalin. 70% of the Russians 20 years ago had positive view of the United States of America. and 64% approved Putin's agreement and Rome Declaration with NATO about joint cooperation between Russia and NATO on global security issues. 57% of Russians wanted to join the European Union. That was the polling of 20 years ago. I think many people who want to blame Russians collectively, they overlook one very simple and very, very visible elephant in the room, which is propaganda. Why has public opinions changed in Russia? This is what I said in Warsaw to some of the speakers who have been attacking collectively the whole Russian society. I said, can you guarantee me that if you are being put in one room with only one television set for 23 years, this is almost the time that has passed since Putin took a last major independent TV channel, NTV, 23 years in one room with one television set. What are the chances that you, a very liberal, democratic, progressive person, would be repeating all these propaganda narratives after 23 years in the same room with the same TV set? I mean, there are basics of human psychology. The chances are predominant. So I think it is very wrong that many people in the free world actually succumb to this tribalistic temptation to blame all the Russians collectively for everything as perpetual imperialists, simply discounting the very evident factor of the influence of propaganda. So, as a matter of fact, I just released a huge video on my YouTube channel about the history of resistance to Putin since he raised to power 25 years ago, and resistance was there if you clearly examined what happened. I mean, actually, you will see that at certain moments, there was very thin line, which was separating Putin from major defeats. Only 13 mandates in 2011 separated the ruling United Russia Party from losing a simple parliamentary majority. You know, when we saw protests on Bolotna and Sakharova, 13 mandates, only 31,000 votes, far less than 1%, separated Alexei Navalny from a runoff in mayoral elections in Moscow in 2013. So as a matter of fact, to make a long story short, Russia did resist significantly, and we were at times only just like a millimeter away from the same things that happened in previous years in Georgia with the Rose Revolution, in Kiev with Orange Revolution and the first Maidan. So, I mean, there is ample evidence that we also resisted pretty much like everybody else. And this is actually from the Orange Revolution and later the Arab Spring that Putin have learned the lessons that the society will one of these days topple him, because people generally want freedom and democracy. And this is actually why, in response to these events, he built a system which currently puts Russia into 15, 20 most repressive dictatorships on earth, along with Eritrea, North Korea, and others. In this society, you don't have any conditions for normal civic resistance because repressions are extreme. It is not a coincidence that a year before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Putin actually, as you rightly said, criminalized the opposition, introducing the so-called extremist criminal case against Navalny organization, basically returning to the 58th article of the Soviet Russian criminal code, anti-Sovietskaya agitatsiya and propaganda, right? So, meaning that we now literally have court decisions which are saying that this one or that one should be sentenced to prison because he was engaged, or her or she was engaged in criminal activities by criticizing the policies of the government. So that is criminalized now. Criticizing policies of the government is criminalized now, which is why, going back to what the opposition is doing, it is forced to operate in extreme conditions. And nonetheless, it is terribly successful in doing so and maintaining the beacon of resistance, because I would estimate, based on the data that we have, that combined audience of all these YouTube, Telegram, and other social media channels of the opposition inside Russia, inside the country now, is between 30 and 35 million unique viewers per month. of which between 10 and 15 million are permanent users and permanent, more or less permanent audience. That's a hell of a lot of people. We're not marginalized. We're breathing in the back of state propaganda. You can actually see Levada polls on social media and internet, and you will see that the audiences are comparable. The audiences of opposition channels on the web plus Telegram channels, whatever, versus the state television. Yeah, state television still is ahead, but we are comparable. And we actually have far bigger outreach now than all these voices of the Western countries, Voice of America, Radio Liberty, Deutsche Welle, had in the 70s and the 80s during the Cold War. That is very important, and we continue to significantly influence public opinion. Because at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, the solid unconditional support for Putin's invasion among Russians, according to the same Levada, was 53% at peak. It is now around 40%. And more people now favor peace negotiations over 50% as opposed to a continuation of the war. It is not to say that this is only us who influence the public opinion, but we do have significant following, significant viewership. And it was for a reason that Putin tried to destroy the opposition before invading Ukraine, because he understood that if we were allowed to operate as normal, there would be a massive anti-war movement like you saw in 2014 after the first invasion into Crimea and Donbass, when we had Russia's biggest cities being marched by tens of thousands of people with Ukrainian flags. So he's clearly afraid of that. So Putin tried to kill us. He failed. We still maintain influence. We have significant audiences inside the country, and they're actually growing over time. So we will continue the fight, and Putin's attempt to shut us down completely have failed miserably. I'll stop here because I think it's important to appreciate what we're really doing and what kind of influence we actually have, because there's too much discussion in the West that we're like nobodies who have zero influence. That is just not true.
Thank you, Vladimir. I want to get back to the question of reaching audiences inside Russia. But first, I'd like to ask Sergey and Ekaterina if you have anything to add or dispute about the role of collective blame on the effect on the opposition. Ekaterina?
Yeah. Thank you. I think Vladimir has said quite enough about this topic. I don't think that after a year and a half of the war, we need to really go into to spend too much time discussing this. Luckily for us, European intellectuals have developed this concept, this problem, so we may rely on their intellectual findings. Collective guilt is part of the concept that is called genocidal thinking. Every genocide, every ethnic cleansing, every chauvinistic activity is based on the concept of collective guilt. Here, that is quite clear. Collective responsibility, on the other hand, is a social fact. If you belong to a community, you share its fate, whether you would or no. That is also self-evident. I really don't see that there's much to discuss here. We are in the active phase of a full-scale war when none of us are quite our normal selves. People will say all kinds of things during such periods. If you will go back to, for example, the years preceding the First World War, and during the First World War, of course, you will see what the European nations wrote and sang and rhymed about each other. You will be amazed, if you haven't been yet, by the intensity of these chauvinistic passions. A year or two after the end of the war, the same people are very much surprised when you remind them of the things they have said and written during the, as I said, the active phase. It happens to humanity.
Sergey?
Yeah, Nasmina, thank you very much for inviting me here. And I share Ekaterina's view and Vladimir's initial remarks on collective guilt and collective responsibility. And I believe that it is a very destructive topic at the moment. It distracts attention of the Russian opposition, it distracts attention of European society, of American society. And instead of helping Ukraine, instead of discussing what's going wrong with Western assistance. War in Ukraine is a war. And all our words can help Ukraine, can help resistance, but they cannot win. In order to win, the West needs to support Ukraine more, not to be too little and too late. That is the most important. And discussing, oh, those Russians, they are terrible, you have so terrible historical heritage. Okay, if we rely on the heritage, Germany or South Korea should not be members of the Western community today, if we rely on the heritage of history. Yeah, and if we compare, if you look on the European history in the 20th century, in fact, there was only one case of the political dictatorship that is comparable to today's Putinism is Germany in 1930s, 1940s. And I'm proud to say that Russian opposition today is much more influential, is much more active than the opposition of Germany in those times, because technology has changed, because the world has changed, because the world is global. Yes, we cannot fight. Yes, we cannot provide a lot of financial assistance. Russian opposition in exile lives a very hard life. And Western countries, European community, European Union, they do all their possible, all their best in order to make our life more difficult. European authorities close banking accounts of Russian opposition. European Commission launches a decree saying that use of private cars by Russian opposition inside Europe is an export activity, and that's why all Russian cars should be nationalized, confiscated. Not Russian assets, not assets of the Russian government, but private cars and private computers and shampoos and underwear should be confiscated because it is export. Yeah, so life is not easy. Life is not so comfortable as we may see it from those discussions. But I am very proud to be a part of Russian opposition, and I believe that altogether, despite all our disagreements, despite all our debates, we do all what we can. Maybe if somebody can do more, okay, give us an advice. We are ready to share. We are open for any ideas. Thank you.
Thank you all. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about what's going on among the main opposition forces, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because in my facts, because the situation has been developing, and from the outside, it's a little bit bewildering sometimes. So one of the main political opposition figures today, Maxim Katz, who rose to prominence as a Moscow Municipal District Assembly member about a decade ago, last weekend called for all leading opposition forces, or at least some leading opposition forces, to unite ahead of the next presidential election, which is coming up next March. He said that these combined forces could count on some 30 million Russians to back them. And he named himself, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the former oil tycoon and political prisoner, and the top figures of Navalny's anti-corruption committee, Maria Pevchikh and Leonid Volkov, to unite and campaign together. He said Khodorkovsky agreed to meet in London this coming Sunday, but the Navalny team declined. More than that, Pevchikh characterized Katz's proposal as an attack on Navalny's group. So, Ekaterina, if I can start with you, can you please sort of explicate a little bit generally what's going on? And I should explain that both you and Sergey are members of Khodorkovsky's anti-war committee.
Well, to make things clear, I am in the collective chat, which has been created by the anti-war committee, but I cannot actually call myself a very active member or indeed a member at all.
Okay, understood. He said that himself when he was in Washington a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, who? Khodorkovsky? Did he? How nice of him. Okay. Being a political scientist, I cannot call myself either an oppositional activist or an activist at all. Indeed, I do not even study opposition. As you mentioned when you introduced me, I study bureaucracy and legislative process. So what, again, strikes me as important, besides the personalities you have mentioned, is the following fact. The Russians, as a civic nation, as a community, are first not very good at forming communities, but there are two kinds of things, two sorts of entities that we are extremely good at creating. And these are media outlets and self-help or human rights organizations. This has been rather a historical tradition with us. We do not create political structures that well because Russians don't generally see the sense of, for example, creating a political party. But we are brilliant at doing media. Russian media are absolutely indestructible. You see how persistently the state tries to prosecute free thought and free expression, but new media are being created, as the Russian expression is, na kolenke, on your knee, almost immediately, and they produce high quality, courageous journalism. Also, we have a very long tradition of human rights defense. The dissidents of Soviet Union or human rights and NGO organizations of the post-Soviet period had moral authority, experience, and they were surprisingly effective given the environment that they had to operate in. The same thing has continued after 2022, when so many Russians have been forced into exile. And let me remind you that although we do not have, unfortunately, reliable statistical information, it has been well considered that this wave of emigration 2022, 2023 has been more intense in terms of, well, people per month or people per year than even the immigration following the revolution of 1917. Between 1917 and 1922, when the Soviet regime started to close its borders in good earnest, more people numerically immigrated. But in terms of intensity, we are dealing with an even more, again, speedy exodus of the people. And these people have managed to recreate or create new structures of, as I said, information, journalism, and self-help and human rights defense in the immigration. So I would not overestimate the degree of infighting, as you called it, in this Russian anti-war community, to put it in more general terms. Because when we call it opposition, it kind of leads our imagination in the wrong direction. Opposition means political structure or structures fighting for power or for political representation, mostly, although not exclusively, by electoral means. Of course, that is impossible either inside of Russia or outside of the country for self-evident reason. So I think we'd better be talking about an anti-war community. So coming back to the infighting in question, I would not overestimate its importance. Life is not concentrated solely on Twitter, or how should we call it now, X? Or whatever, X platform. I'm not on Twitter myself, so maybe I'm just missing all that is important in life. But once there is a common goal, like recently there was a big activity for a fundraising activity for collecting money for political prisoners and their families. And there we have seen how Navalny's people and Maxim Katz, whom you mentioned, and many, many others, public speakers and journalists participated in this together. They were in the same studio. So nothing prevented them from this collective action because they have seen the purpose. There was a very concrete and understandable goal. So unity is produced by this common goal, not by the idea that to unite would be a good thing to do. So it doesn't matter much who said what to whom on Twitter. This very discussion has originated because the presidential campaign is drawing close. And as we understand the nature of authoritarian elections, we know that this is the period when the system is at its most vulnerable. So some sort of course of action has to be figured out. It hasn't been figured out yet. And again, for all the public loudness of this discussion, it is not yet a discussion. Both sides as I understand them, are saying basically the same thing. We need to find a course of action, but we haven't found it yet. Only what Maxim is saying is that let's all collect together let's gather in London, and then we will figure out what to do. And what Navalny's people are saying is that we are doing our own research, and once we have enough information and once we have made our analysis, we will come up with some sort of plan.
Thank you, Vladimir. I can see you'd like to say something, but I want to ask you, as a close Navalny ally and somebody who has been saying quite a lot over the past week about what's been going on. Agree, disagree? Can you characterize what's going on?
I agree with a lot of what Ekaterina had said, and generally, I would try to explain to the Westerners in some very short number of sentences what's going on with this so-called infighting between the Russian opposition. I understand that it's a sort of a sexy, sensational topic, makes good headlines. Russian opposition is fighting each other again. But in reality, the most relevant comparison is the global debate on climate change. We have something that is exactly reminiscent of what happens with the climate change debate. You have 97% of scientists who agree that climate change is caused by humans, but you have 3% who disagree, profoundly write papers, scientific research on that, and so on. This 3% has been given a disproportional representation, Google false balance or both sidesism, when journalists, just for the sake of creating a debate, because people are interested in a debate, artificially elevate this 3% of climate change denying scientists, making it look like, oh, there is a debate going on in scientific community about climate change. Well, in reality, it was not. Before Russia ratified Kyoto Protocol in 2004, we had this guy, Yuri Israel, from the Academy of Sciences, who was like all over the place saying that, no, it's not proven that humans cause global warming. Pretty much the same as Maxim Katz today. Maxim Katz only served as a local deputy in Moscow for 1 5-year term. We have like hundreds of these people in the opposition who served multiple terms, were chairman of local city councils, were member of regional parliaments, and so on. None of them is given such a proportional coverage as Maxim Katz for some reason. Most of nearly all of Maxim Katz's activities in politics have been a spectacular failure, each and every involvement he had. Particularly the last thing was the constitutional referendum on 2020, which was a spectacular failure. But somehow Maxim Katz is given this disproportional coverage simply because some people want to create this sort of artificial debate that actually we have such a profound disagreements that we cannot go on. Yes, we can go on. We're doing a lot of important things. We work with the Russian audience and are successfully broadcasting, and Maxim Katz is welcome on concentrating on that positive and fruitful activity and not trying to bite and kick the colleagues in the democratic opposition forces. We work a lot with Western governments trying to calibrate the sanctions, making them more effective. And there is a lot more of positive activity. I think our real big problem is that we are somehow undersold, because we're doing a lot of good and useful stuff. But again, we just had these discussions at the Warsaw Security Forum. People are unaware of it often, and this is our fault. So the problem is not that we are infighting, but the problem is that we do not actually explain to many audiences in the West in what productive, useful activity we are involved in a daily basis and what are the results. And listen, I had these conversations many, many times. I just cannot understand why you, people in Europe and America, want to create a one single democratic KPSS, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So we have one presidium where we have a democratic Brezhnev, democratic Suslov, democratic Chernenko, and a democratic Lenin portrait behind our backs. And we stand like, applauding and voting 100% unanimously. Why do you want to do that? European Union has a motto called United in Diversity. That's the official motto of the European Union. They have 27 countries, member states, which bitterly argue between themselves on most important policy issues, and you can see it daily. Does it make European Union a failure? No. I had a dinner 4 months ago in Madrid with one of the leaders of Venezuelan opposition, Leopoldo Lopez, and he complained to me about the same thing. He said, for some reason, Westerners want all us Venezuelans to join one big united KPSS. We don't want to do that. We want to concentrate on whatever positive activities we're focused on, deliver the results. It takes a lot of flexibility. Sometimes it takes being, separated into different groups, which all focused on important things that are key for their activity. It's called division of labor, something on which the modern civilization, as we know it, has been built. So I suggest that, I think this topic of infighting divisions, it's, so much oversold. there's really very little happening in reality substantively. And if you just do not try to play this false balance and elevate this 3% of climate change deniers, then you'll see what the real picture is.
Thanks, Vladimir. Sergey, you have your hand up, but please respond. I will just say, if you don't mind, that Khodorkovsky's group, of which you remember, the anti-war committees, convening a meeting in Berlin later this month for the purposes of gathering together anti-war groups. But let me also just say this. Khodorkovsky himself says he also doesn't advocate a unified opposition, and he says that any such single group would appoint one leader who could become even more dictatorial than Putin. Khodorkovsky and others say they want a coalition instead to represent various groups and voices that would form the foundation in the future, hopefully, of a parliamentary system in Europe. Could you explain the distinction and, of course, respond to what's been said, please?
I will try. First, Anti-War Committee is not organization of Mikhail Khodorkovsky. It is a more informal club of Russian politicians, Russian businessmen in exile, Russian intellectuals in exile, who are debating their joint views and trying to combine, to concentrate the Russian opposition attention to the problem of the war and the position of the opposition regarding what's going on. So it's not Khodorkovsky committee, and there is no leader in this committee. So that's all of us are equal. Some of us are members of the chart, some of us are active members of the chart, some of us are coordinators, but nevertheless, it's not a formal organization led or financed or what else ever by Mikhail Khodorkovsky or Garry Kasparov or someone else who is in this group. Second, I'm very sad to hear what Vladimir was talking about, because as you rightly mentioned, nobody is proposing to establish KPSS, CPSU, Communist Party. And nobody proposed to unify a position in one group, one organization, or to establish the joint program. And I want to remind Vladimir a story. Something like 13 years ago, maybe 14 years ago, 2009, there were 4 political leaders of opposition in Russia: Boris Nemtsov, Mikhail Kasyanov, Vladimir Ryzhkov, and Vladimir Milov. And all of them were fighting one with another because for the popularity. None of them was able to participate in elections. None of them was able to raise any public support. Nevertheless, all their time they spent on fighting one against another. It took us half a year of negotiations and to agree that joining forces, we may reach much more, because by that time, there was only one real problem for us to agree upon, is to fight Putin regime. And that is the only one goal that is really in front of us. Those 4 leaders signed an agreement, established a political organization named Parnas. And that was I don't know, was it a real trigger, or was it just a situational success? But nevertheless, after this organization, after this party was established, the protest movement, opposition movement started to rise in Moscow and all over the Russia. And it resulted in the famous December 2011 meetings in Moscow. Unfortunately, by that time, Alexei Navalny and his team, being very active members of the political opposition, said, okay, we will not join you. And we don't want to agree with you upon anything. Finally, the opposition was not able to agree upon the joint position how to vote in December 2011 elections. And yes, United Russia won the elections with a very marginal votes, maybe because Nemtsov and Navalny, Milov and Navalny, Kasyanov and Navalny, Ryzhkov and Navalny were not able to agree about joint view. What to do together in order to defeat United Russia in elections. Nobody was talking about to win elections. There was no any political party in those elections who represented our views. Nevertheless, our goal was to defeat United Russia, not to allow United Russia to get the majority. And we were very close. Maybe our disagreement was the result that we failed that time. Today, we have only one real problem that is facing us in March 2024. It's not elections. There will not be any candidate we are happy to support. It is a plebiscite, like in any dictatorial regime. And so the only one real view, real position would be, let's try to protest against this plebiscite. Let's try to say no together. And that is the only one story that Maxim Katz proposes. Yeah, nothing else. No organization, no leadership, no programs. Let's try to build a joint, as Ekaterina rightly mentioned, very successful media campaign, because Russian opposition media are very inventive, are very creative. Let's do it together. The only one target we can follow right now in the short run until March 2024 is to say together no to Putin. Nothing else. I don't understand why Milov, Volkov, Pievchik says, no, it's a bad policy. It's a bad policy. I don't know what is good policy. If saying no to Putin is a bad policy, means saying yes is a good policy. That's it.
Vladimir, why not unite, not over a political organization or political goals, but just to oppose the war, oppose Putin?
First, I have to remind that everything that Sergey said about the Parnas story and what happened 10, 15 years ago was wrong. It was exactly the opposite. Because we had a decade of attempts to create all these united opposition forces, Committee 2008, the Other Russia, United Civic Front, Solidarity. Parnas was just a name on the list, in this very long list of attempts to build the same united opposition that Sergey is talking. It all failed miserably because 95% of the time was spent on internal fighting on who occupies which chair. Like Boris Nikolaevich Yeltsin used to say, "Не так сели." Stepashin is the first deputy chairman of the cabinet of ministers. You remember that story, right? But then everything changed because Alexei Navalny came. And he ended that, and he built a more modern political organization with new faces and with significant dynamics that did not exist in the past decade. And he launched this successful campaign, Vote for Any Party Except United Russia, in 2011. And then were the protests. The protests were not because of Parnas. Parnas was terribly ineffective, and Boris Nemtsov was advocating for spoiling the ballots, which gathered like a fraction of 1%. But Navalny's campaign was very successful. So I am siding with forces who bring deliverables, who bring results, who just not to try to self-promote themselves by saying, oh, unite with me because I'm sort of sidelined and forgotten. I need to bring myself back on stage. Please unite with me. Why you are so divided and so on. This is useless talk. If you want to launch a nationwide political campaign aimed at March 2024 elections, whatever, just do it. Just do it. Why do you need to constantly attack Navalny, attack Anti-Corruption Foundation, which is really busy every day doing some really very useful stuff? You want to launch a successful campaign? Go ahead. Be my guest. What stands in your way? No. Here we have this classical tactics of persons who are forgotten, whom no one needs, who are sidelined, who want to bring attention to themselves. The easiest way, how do you generate attention? You attack the most able, the most potent opposition force on a daily basis, accusing it of not being able to negotiate. These political forces say, look, we're busy. Why do we have to unite with you? Because I'm sorry to say, but Maxim Katz has extreme and intolerable reputational problems. That is the why. Pick someone else. Please, Sergey, if you want to have a united opposition for purpose, for presidential election campaign, don't pick a guy with such a severe reputational problems. Pick somebody else. And maybe we will be closer to forging some united campaign in 2024. As has been said, Navalny's team is working on this. They're trying to, we have very complicated situation. No observers allowed at election. Electronic voting, which is totally falsified and distorted. We have to come up with some serious plan, not just declarative talk. So, I mean, it will be very good if we stop this discussion about united opposition in forms of personal attacks against Navalny team. Let them do the positive work. They are doing a lot. If somebody has this genius idea how to defeat Putin in 2024, go ahead. I mean, do it. Navalny team does not interfere. It never impedes and never puts any obstacle to all this activity. It is just focused on the positive, useful stuff that they've been doing over the years. Leave them alone, for God's sake.
Got it, Vladimir. Sergey, with apologies, we can continue the conversation, but I'd like to move on because there's some important questions that I really like to get to when time is moving on quickly. I'd like to ask about the upcoming presidential election in March, which will very presumably deliver Putin a 6-year term that would take his time in power to 30 years. No one can have any doubt that the election will be a total sham. Nevertheless, could it be seen, at least to some extent, as a reflection of the Russian people taking responsibility for the war and the repression? Because even managed unfree elections can reinforce the impression that the Russian people are to blame, both in the West and perhaps even among the opposition in exile. Ekaterina, let me ask you, is there a danger of more demoralization or the perception in the West after this election, the results with which cannot be affected from the outside of the political opposition? But could this reinforce the sense among the rest of the world that Russia is completely a lost cause?
This is exactly one of the goals that autocracies pursue when they conduct elections. As you mentioned at the very beginning, Russia's political regime is not unique at all. We call it, in political science, we call it an authoritarian learning or authoritarian international. Autocracies learn from each other. They share best practices for keeping in power. And one of the tools that they use for keeping in power and to re-legitimize themselves is this thing called authoritarian elections. Authoritarian elections are almost as important as democratic elections in a democracy, but in a different way and for a different reason. Authoritarian elections are a two-pronged exercise. It's an exercise for the bureaucracy, which has to conduct these elections and demonstrate their loyalty and their effectiveness. It's like a big festival. Everyone is engaged. Regional administrations, local administrations, federal political management, anti-extremist bodies in the Ministry of the Interior, the FSB, the loyalistic media, everyone. So this event, this campaign, has to be conducted in a certain manner, decently, orderly, and without visible scandals. So this is the bureaucratic exercise. The bureaucrats demonstrate what they are there for. And more specifically, regional governors bring a required number of votes to Moscow thus justifying their positions as regional governors. The second exercise is for the people, and this in turn is divided into two tasks. For the so-called administratively dependent electorate, people working for the state, directly or indirectly, the task is to turn out and vote. They need to go and cast the ballot in an administratively approved manner. It's the business of the heads of industries, as well as of the regional governors, to ensure that their people, their staff, are doing what they're supposed to do. And all the rest, and the rest is a majority. The majority is never voting. The majority has to stay at home. So any other people except this administratively dependent electorate, or in polling terms, a loyalistic core, they have to stay at home. They have to be divided, demoralized. They have to, well, fail repeatedly to see any sense, any meaning in engaging in this electoral exercise. So once those two goals are met, you have successful authoritarian elections. You re-establish your legitimacy. You show to the world that your people are loyal, even if passively loyal, that they kind of agree, they accept these results with the full knowledge that there are falsifications. People know about falsifications. But the reasoning, the desired reasoning is this. On the morning after the elections, you are told that the incumbent received 85% of votes. And you as a citizen think, well, maybe it was not 85. Maybe they kind of painted something. But of course, it was more than 50. Sometimes it goes wrong. How can authoritarian elections go wrong? We have seen in 2020 in Belarus. When you hear this declared result of 85% in favor of incumbent, but then you think, no, it was not 85, it was actually only 3, then your autocracy is in trouble. We have seen regime collapse in Belarus. The status quo was defended only by direct interference of a big Eastern neighbor. Can the same thing happen in Russia in 2024? Well, there is a well-known saying that in democratic elections, the results are unpredictable, but consequences are predictable. And in autocracies, it's the other way around. Results are predictable, but consequences are not. So it is not impossible that election campaign can trigger some sort of, well, different types of consequences. Maybe the bureaucracy will not be that enthusiastic. Maybe there will be protests during elections and after elections. Maybe this widespread, this diffuse dissatisfaction will be converted into some form of political behavior. It is not impossible. It doesn't seem very likely from the point we're currently in. Speaking of opposition, any sort of mutual or divided activity can only be aimed at attempting to achieve this conversion of diffuse dissatisfaction into some sort of political activity. That will demonstrate both to Russians and to the outside world that the president is not so popular as he declares himself to be.
Thank you, Ekaterina. I see we've got 5 minutes until we're at the top of the hour. If you don't mind, we'll go on another 15 minutes and we'll get to the Q&A there. There's one more last question of mine that I'd like to pose to you, Sergey, about the West, and then happy to return to the March election and to unify, not to unify. What's the importance? The role of Western governments, Sergey, they've been accused by some of not actually wanting to remove Putin, of fearing regime change because of the concern that Russia could fall apart into an unmanageable chaos. Are those worries justified? And also, I'd like to ask, what is the best way that the West can support the Russian opposition?
A short step back. Elections in authoritarian regimes or in dictatorship are very funny. And if the West is interested how it should treat the results of March 17th next year presidential elections in Russia, I can only laugh. In 1936 and in 1938, there were elections and referendums in Germany, in Nazi Germany. In both cases, Nazis party list got 99+% of votes, and 99% plus of voters voted for occupation of Rhineland and annexation or Anschluss of Austria. Does it change anything in the nature of Hitler regime? Should we really discuss, is 99% a real figure? Or maybe it was 79, or maybe it was 37. So presidential elections in Russia are not elections. It's a shame, it's a fake. And if the West is really believe that any number Putin will get there, 75% or 85% is a real number, that means the West does not understand anything in what's going on in Russia and what is Putin's regime. So that's, I think it's better to forget about those numbers. What the West can do? The West can do only one thing. The West can help Ukraine. Because today, Putin's popularity is based on its rather successful war in Ukraine. At least Russia propaganda is able to deliver a message, okay, Russian army is successful, we got a big chunk of Ukrainian territory, we have annexed 4 regions, we continue our offensive, Ukrainians are failing, the West is collapsing, United States stop supporting Ukraine, that means Ukraine is alone, okay, victory is very close. So that's it, it's very simple. Yes, of course, it's very important for Russian opposition if European Commission will review its stupid decisions about private cars and private PCs, private Macs, and so on. Yes, it will be helpful. It will be very helpful if European Commission will review its rules together with European central banks on banking accounts for Russian in exile. Yes, it will be very helpful. It will be very helpful if European Commission will discuss and agree upon something like the nonsense passport for Belarusian refugees or Russian refugees who will not be able to renew their passports, because without passports you cannot survive in the modern world. Yes, it will be very helpful for the normal life of Russians in exile, of Belarusians in exile. But it will not help to remove Putin. Today, the only one factor that helps Putin, that may help removal of Putin, is Ukrainian victory, military victory. It's very simple, it's very straight, and don't look for any other answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergey. So we'll go on for another 15 minutes, and I'll take questions from the Q&A chat. I will do my best to get to as many as possible, and I apologize for those I can't get to. I'll start with a question from Walker Trimble, and he asks, is it not the case that coordinated efforts of the opposition work better, and that media and social work has its limits? And I'll return to you, Sergey, because maybe you can incorporate a follow-up to a response to Vladimir from earlier.
It's a nice question, but once again, you have to remember what was said today during our discussions, that any political activity opposing Putin is criminalized in Russia. So any public activity in Russia, any oral activity, Twitter activity, Telegram activity, YouTube activity, if you say something, you can be sentenced to spend years in jail. So it's very difficult to agree upon or to promote any public activity, political opposition activity within Russia. All what we can do is to run media resources, to promote information, to disperse information, to try to reach Russian audience that is within Russia, and to explain what's going on. And nobody answering to Vladimir's position. Unfortunately, he didn't give the answer. Is he ready to support Putin on the plebiscite or not? And nobody, including myself, was not ready to elect Maxim Katz as a political leader. I named an idea. If Vladimir Putin says that 2 by 2 is 4, he is right. If Maxim Katz says, let's vote no on plebiscite, okay, it's a good idea. I support idea, it's not a problem. It's if Navalny, if Volkov, if Pevchik will say, okay, let's do it, let's do it. And nobody in April this year, all opposition forces, intellectual forces of Russia in exile, except of Navalny's group, were present in Berlin. And they signed a joint declaration. We do not fight one to another. And we keep our promise. Nobody is fighting Navalny. Nobody is fighting FBK. Guys, do your job. Be happy.
We'll take a question from Joseph Bradley, who writes that it appears that the anti-war movement consists mainly or exclusively of non-state actors. At the critical moment, will the movement need state actors to weaken the state's ability to retain its monopoly of power? Let me go to Vladimir for that. Ekaterina and Sergey, if you'd like to jump in, please do.
Greg, it's easier said than done because many people who mull a split of the Russian elites have very little idea what they're talking about, because these elites are extremely strongly consolidated for a reason. They are part of an integrated monopolistic system that has been emerging over the quarter of a century. So you don't, take them out just like, peanuts from a cup. There's a reason why in over a year and a half since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, there's been zero split of the elites, and only some very few really secondary or tertiary figures have said something against the war and so on. They are intertwined for a reason. I wrote in detail about that. There's my lengthy piece in the independent Russian media outlet called The Insider. It's also translated into English. You can find it there in opinion section. I would not repeat it, but it will be great if some of the state actors join us. But there are reasons why this is not happening. These reasons are so serious that we should not be expecting. There is no life in the solar system except on Earth. Sorry, we haven't discovered yet. So it will be good if we find suddenly some alien civilization right here in our proximity. But, many years of efforts have been fruitless so far, and for a reason. So I think that's the case with split of the elites. All hopes for it are not really based on the actual analysis who these elites are and how they behave. So I think it's a bit unrealistic.
Thank you. Next question from Christian Forstner, and maybe this should go to you, Ekaterina. Would it be legally possible to nominate Alexei Navalny as candidate for Russian president? And I guess the question to Vladimir and Sergey as part of this, if so, would you agree to nominate Alexei Navalny?
No, it's legally impossible because he's serving the term. But I think this leads us to a more broad question. Should the anti-war Russia, wherever it is situated, nominate a candidate on these elections with the full understanding that this person will not be registered as a candidate, but even with an understanding that this person should be, at the moment of nomination, rather be situated outside of Russia, because there will be immediate risk of violent death, to put matters simply. Should we have this kind of virtual campaign headed by somebody with enough visibility, moral authority, political history to be a uniting figurehead of this anti-war campaign? This is a question which demands, I think, serious thinking. Again, none of the parties mentioned during this discussion have come up with any decision as to either the fact of participating in these elections or the manner of this participation, if participation is decided upon. There are two ways of participating in elections. There is direct way, like you try to run and engage the sympathies of the electorate. And there's the secondary participation, the one invented by Navalny team, the smart voting. When you cannot run, you cannot have your own candidate, you cannot have your own party, but you vote for the second best option, or rather for anyone rather than the ruling party or the incumbent. I think the situation in March in 2022 will be such as to prevent either direct participation, that is clear, you cannot have a candidate, or even indirect participation, because telling people to vote for Gennady Zyuganov will be both reputationally damaging and politically fruitless, because the anti-war people will not do that. And there will be no other candidate, no anti-war candidate, because again, that is the main point. The main point in which you disagree with the current Russian leadership is exactly about the war. And as I think Vladimir said in the beginning of our discussion, the hardcore supporters of the war are by no means a majority. You have cited, I think it was you, Gregory, you have cited the figures of Levada polling center, but recently the head of TSIOM, which is the state-owned sociological service, said in a public interview that the militarist core are 10 to 15%. And the rest of the Russian people, as in his words, didn't want this war. They would not have started it in the first place, but now they're in it. They think that we have to go on because there are no other options. But they are not hungry for territorial conquest, quote unquote. So that is the situation in the estimation of the most pro-Kremlin sociologists out there. In this situation, I think there may be at least some food for thought in this direction. But again, you cannot participate in elections directly, and you cannot participate by proxy, because all your proxies will be pro-war.
Thank you. Sergey?
Just a very short add to what Ekaterina said. Alexei Navalny is not able to be nominated for another 20 years after he will be released from the prison according to the current Russian laws. So that's the answer to the question.
So we have a question, a rather long, interesting question from Vladimir Lumelsky. If I hope he doesn't mind that I will sort of summarize that and sort of add it to a question about legitimacy, the discussion that we've been having and will be ongoing. But because today's opposition leaders haven't been elected and in that sense don't have a formal popular mandate, one view is that in order to build trust among supporters, they should be trying to represent the interests of the hundreds of thousands, maybe a million more Russian exiles abroad in various countries around the world. Maybe back to you, Sergey. Is that should that be an important goal?
I think it's a stupid idea. Because it will move us to debate about personalities, as Vladimir did, about who is more important, who is more influential, who is counting votes, and is he right or is he not? And it will distract us from our only target at the moment, at today's life, to defeat Putin, to make all possible Putin to collapse. And that's it. All our disagreements about what is our economic program, should we revise privatization, what is our social policy, how we'll rebuild our education, it's a problem for the next free elections, if and when. Today, we have no disagreements in principle. Our principal agreement is to defeat Putin and to make Russia a democratic country with free elections. So free and fair elections. So, and that's why to try to launch elections today for the people who live in dozens of the countries, I think we will spend time, money, efforts, and it will be a great hassle. And finally, okay, somebody will receive 27%, another will receive 21%, somebody will receive 2.5%, and what of that? We will be enemies among ourselves and we will forget about our problems, real problems.
Thank you. We have a question from Jackson Lopez, and maybe this should go to you, Vladimir, because you mentioned this. How involved are Russian opposition groups in lobbying Western governments to take decisive action in Ukraine, i.e. sending heavier weaponry? Has this changed since the outset of the war, and what are the implications for future cooperation with Western governments?
Yes, we do cooperate very actively. Again, early this morning, I just arrived back from Warsaw. I spent 2 days in the Warsaw Security Forum, and actually you can watch a lot of discussions that took place there. The open, not classified part of the forum is on YouTube. And we have been, Russian opposition have been actively lobbying for broader support of Ukraine and tougher sanctions against Putin even before the full-scale invasion. And when Putin invaded and the West needed to take tough action against him, actually it was a lot of our recommendations which were sleeping and sort of left motionless for some time that were taken as a blueprint for swift action. So yes, we continue to greatly contribute for that. And there'll be more. I mean, I'm going to Riga conference, Halifax International Security Forum, Washington, D.C. in the coming weeks, and Brussels and so on. So yes, we're very actively involved in that. And since the beginning of the war, it had only accelerated, and the West even, more began to ask more frequently for our opinion on how do sanctions work and so on. So we're actively engaged in that.
Thank you. Lots of questions. I will ask one final question, and maybe go to you, Ekaterina, first. If you can say what's being done to help political prisoners inside Russia, and how important for the entire opposition movement is it to keep them on the Western agenda? You're muted.
Okay, sorry. I hope you can hear me now. Yes, it's a very good question, and it points at a very important issue. Cynically speaking, political prisoners are every dissident movement's political capital. They have moral authority like no other people can possibly have. We have, again, we would very much like to do without this sort of political and moral capital, but we're getting more and more of it. Bright and brilliant people are behind the bars. We are still fortunate, if there can be anything fortunate in this situation, in the fact that they have opportunities to communicate with the outside world. That it is indeed a fortunate situation can be seen in comparison with Belarus, where there are hundreds and hundreds, thousands of political prisoners after 2020 and even earlier, and for months even their families cannot get any information about them. We are not there yet, although I must say as a political scientist that our sister country, Belarus, is usually about 2 years in advance of Russia in terms of its political development. So we may arrive there yet. But we are not there at the moment, so these people can communicate with the outside world, and they do it quite regularly and actively, like Alexei Navalny does, like Ilya Yashin, like Alexei Gorinov, Zhenya Berkovich, and other political prisoners. There's quite a movement, of which I'm a modest part, of writing letters to political prisoners and receiving answers. By the way, I was surprised to learn the fact, you always learn new things when you communicate with the Russian prison system, that of course there are no radios and TVs only turned on one official channel. And since there are no newspapers, the way people inside prisons get news is by their lawyers or their relatives printing out transcripts of what we say, dear colleagues, and then bringing them to prison. So transcripts of political programs on YouTube are a very valuable commodity in the political prisoners environment. I try not to think about it when I do speak, because it will freeze the tongue of the most talkative person when you think that whatever you say will be read in a prison cell. But that seems to be the fact. So may we continue, may we keep this very thin and tremulous communication lines while they are available for us. And political history tells us that political prisoners usually get liberated at the first stage of any regime transfer, even if we have a successor who inherits after an autocrat is dead. Even this successor, like it was in case of Uzbekistan quite recently, announces some sort of liberalization, and there is usually an amnesty, and some people get to go free. So the West needs to remember it always. I understand, and here we are treading on brittle ground, but I understand there is some talk of an exchange. The key figures of Russian anti-war movement like Alexei Navalny or Ilya Yashin will probably not agree to be part of this exchange. But if something along these lines happens, we can only cross our fingers and hope for the best and hope that as many people as possible will be freed. So whenever there's any semblance of regime change or even regime transformation, the West, the international community in general, should by no means forget that the first demand before any sort of talk is started with the, again, let it be Mishustin or Sobyanin who may inherit now the Russian presidency. Before anything else, the release of political prisoners should be 0.0, not even 0.1 of any communication, of any agreement, of any talks at all.
Thank you for that. And of course, there's also Vladimir Karamurza, who issued a very interesting letter from prison last week that I wish we had time to talk about, but we will have to leave it there. I hope we will continue the conversation. Thank you all for really a terrific, fascinating, important discussion. And thanks to everybody joining in the audience. And thank you for your terrific questions. Also, thanks to the U.S. Institute of Peace and to American Purpose for joining the Institute of Current World Affairs for this panel. Before we go, I just want to ask you to please join us for our future panels at the U.S. Institute of Peace and virtually over Zoom. The next one will be about Russian scholars in exile on Thursday, November 16th, also at 10 a.m. in Washington. How are Russian academics abroad trying to keep teaching, researching, and preserving Russia's intellectual capital for future generations post-Putinism? And finally, in January, we'll discuss post-Putinist Russia. What are the plausible scenarios for post-authoritarian Russia? What roles should the U.S. and other Western governments be playing? And what lessons learned from the post-Soviet 1990s? Please stay tuned for an exact date for that talk. Meanwhile, thank you all very much. We look forward to continuing the conversation.